All right, can you hear me as well? Get on these, yeah, like a deep lunge. Good. Do the whole fitness instructor thing. All right, are we good to go? Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, okay, I can talk. I can definitely do good sound tests. Just need someone to let me know if they can hear me, if the audio is pretty good. I'm going to talk a little louder probably. Okay, sweet. Thank you so much. All right. Okay, we're ready to talk more about CSS. So this is going to be a little bit more challenging. We got more people in this room. Senior Core has no more breakouts, so that'll be the case this week and next, where afternoon breakouts could be in there optionally. We could try it out here, and you could decide to move into that other room tomorrow afternoon if this doesn't work for you. So kind of keep in mind that you can give feedback like that if you want, right? So I won't be lecturing tomorrow afternoon, but whoever does, maybe you get to decide at that point. All right. So CSS is hard. Does anybody disagree with this? You wouldn't disagree because then I might challenge you on it, right? I think it's fair to say it's hard, and some of the reasons I think it's hard is because I'm not going to do any more lunges. Sorry, Victoria. That was just to get your attention. I'm going to say CSS is hard because it's not like things that we've been doing already. It's not like JavaScript. It's not a language like that. It's kind of this weird declarative thing where you set properties and then just hope that something, maybe it'll match up with something, and if it does, those properties will be applied to that thing. And that's different than kind of calling a function and passing in a parameter, right? So I'd say it's hard because it's quite a bit different than the program we've been doing so far. I'd also say it's hard because there's so many different properties that come from there's this massive timeline of CSS. And you have properties from when CSS was created, and then properties that came in order to fix some of those old properties and make things better. And as the new versions come out, we have more and more properties to remember. And then these things behave differently depending on the properties you choose, the values you choose for those properties, how you nest these things. I think for all those reasons, CSS could be considered hard. That's why we have people that just do only CSS in larger companies. All they do is focus on CSS all day. It's a big enough problem to have people focused on that. We talked this morning about a little bit about HTML, how style sheets cascade, why they're named cascading style sheets. We talked about how to create rules, how to put properties and values for those rules. We talked about how we can use shorthand properties. We can set the display property to block or inline. So we learned quite a bit this morning about CSS. Then we talked about layout near the end and how we can use float to create a multi-column layout. This afternoon we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things we missed this afternoon or this morning. Position. So how do we actually position things in the document? We talked about sizing, but we didn't talk about how we talked about the size of things, but not the position of those things. So far we've just let the layout system decide where things go, but we actually have the ability to set the position of elements as well. We'll talk about specificity. So when we find we want to apply properties to certain elements, we might need to be a bit more specific about which element we're talking about here. If we apply this certain style to all paragraphs, but then we want one paragraph to have a little bit of a different look, we might need to be more specific so that that style applies to it instead, or those properties apply to it instead. And then we'll spend a little bit more this afternoon talking about that grid system that I showed you, and how you do more layout style stuff. Okay. So position. This is all about that top left corner. Where does this thing go in the document? And we have a position property with a number of possible values. Here they are. Here are the possible, let's say these are the values for position. static is the default for everything, it seems. I haven't found something that is not defaulted to static, that actually has a different default position. Maybe you find it, let me know, that would be awesome. But let's just say for now, elements that do not, if the position property has not been set, it will be a static element. And what this means is it's just going to behave in the way that the layout engine, wherever it positions it. If I have 3 divs, they're all positioned statically. The first div is at the origin, maybe the top of the document. The next div is whatever the height of that first div was, that far down the page, right? So static is just let the layout system position this. And then we've got this idea of relative positioning, where we can actually now, if we set something's position to be relative, we have the ability to actually use some new properties: top, left, bottom, and right. So we could actually say that the top of this thing is 0, that would be the top of the document, or 200, that would be 200 pixels from the top of the document. So we can kind of say once something is no longer static, it is now able to be positioned with the top, left, right, and bottom properties. So relative, absolute, fixed all enable these other properties for us. We can use those now. And there is a slight difference between them. So let's just say that if these were my elements and they all had, that I didn't put any position on any of them, and they were the natural layout, maybe they're inline elements, they're all going to be kind of next to each other like this, right? And this is just naturally where that element would go. I've highlighted the second one here. But it's true for any of these. This is relative. Relative will be positioned based on where naturally it would go. But if I decide to set the top and left properties of a relative element, we see this is actually the behavior we get. It offsets it by 20 pixels from the place that it would have been normally. I don't have the problem with teaching this stuff is that nowadays, if we were to redesign this, we probably wouldn't do it this way, right? It's kind of old. So the term relative, we'll come back to that because it is important with the next thing here. So let's just say normally, if we didn't put a top and left, it's gonna look like a static element. But if we set the top and left, it's going to then offset that from where its origin would have been. Is that fair? All right. Now absolute. This one's kind of interesting because once I set it to absolute, I get to set the top and the left to 20 pixels. But you'll notice that it has nothing to do with where it would have been positioned before. I would have with the relative behavior, it still pushes all those elements around. The next thing is moved over the size of, or as much as it needs to be. But in this case, it looks like setting something to absolute actually kind of takes it out of the normal layout, kind of like we had with float. Okay. And if we assign the top and the left value to that, then it's going to offset from that origin, the top corner of the document, by that amount. Does that somewhat make sense? So this means that we can actually position an element anywhere on the document that we want just by setting its position to absolute and then giving it a top, left, bottom, right, or other options for us. If I give it a bottom of 0 and a top of 200, we'll have a gap. It'll start at 200 and it'll go all the way to the bottom. So bottom, it is relative to the bottom, upwards to the right this way. So right 0 is all the way over to the right. Left 0 is all the way over to the left. So let's say that this viewport is a large box, and we can decide where we want the edges to go to for this element. Does that roughly make sense? It's a hard kind of concept for me to explain. Okay. So the question is, does it change the size when it does that, or does it just take up the space? It doesn't take up the space. It's going to be positioned absolutely, which means it's not going to care about anything else that's in the document. It's just going to position it at the location I give it here. And if I change the size, the width, and the height, it doesn't really affect any of the other elements around it. So I'm not. Yeah, then it will be the whole span. Yeah, so for Victoria, if I set it to top 0 and bottom 0, it's going to span the entire height of the document, of that viewport. Yeah. No, the size. It would change its size. Yeah. It looks like, Okay. So let's look at this example. All right. And bring up the inspector. Okay. So static's pretty straightforward. It's just going to go there. Relative, we talked about, that's going to actually kind of offset it instead. And then absolute. Oh, I think I actually messed this up a little bit because I need to revert some of these changes. One moment. Position, I'm going to just revert this change. Go back to what I should have. There, that's better. Okay, so we've got that same example here. Fixed is kind of interesting because you notice it's actually positioned here, but if I scroll, it reveals a different story. That based on the natural layout of this document, this element will be positioned here. But then when I move it, because it's a fixed element, it actually stays wherever. Oh. Can't see the screen. Oh, shit. Sorry. That's right. What I wanted was, do you want full screen or split screen? Because I can do this, and I can do this with a little me, and I can do big me like this. Then is this right? We'll keep split screen new space, or little me. These are, let's say these are the two options. Little me, okay. Well, if you want to change it, let me know. Thank you for letting me. Thanks for that, though. I should have switched it back myself. Okay. So where was I? Yes. Okay. So we were talking about this fixed element. Naturally, it would just go here, but it is actually not affecting any of the elements after it, which is kind of interesting. And then when I scroll, it's actually going to be going to stay positioned wherever kind of it last was, or wherever it left off in that viewport. All right. The one thing I want to show you, though, is there is sort of a relationship between absolute and relative that is not very intuitive, like the rest of CSS, I guess. Okay. So I've got all these elements here. I've got my So this is the behavior for absolute that I originally described, is that it doesn't matter where it would have been rendered originally. Once I make it absolute and I give it a top and a left value, then it's just going to look at the root of my viewport up here and then offset from there. So this is why this element is right here. It was absolutely positioned. It was taken out of the flow, so that means that it doesn't have any effect. Well, actually, it does have an effect. These things are where they would be laid out naturally as static elements. But what if I want to position something absolutely relative to its parent container? Might that be useful? Because in this case, it's just relative to the whole viewport. If I want to apply the absolute position to an element, and I want it to be relative to its container, then I have to make its container a positioned element, and the options for that are absolute and relative. So what I've done by calling this positioned, which is really just position relative, is I've now made its container, the thing that's containing that absolute element, its display property is relative, so it will change the behavior of its child that has an absolute property. Okay? Let me reload this. There we go. It's now moved down. And this is simply because now this element here is inside of a container. Oops. No, where are you? Not relative. Positioned up here. This element right here is inside of a container that's positioned as relative. And if I disable this, now it's no longer relative to its container, it's relative to the entire document, which is what absolute's default behavior might be. So what it's doing here is an absolute element will look for its closest parent positioned element and then go relative to that. Yeah, I know. It's absolute relative and it's not intuitive in that way, okay? I would play around with this a little bit and then ask for some more help if it's not clear, because it really is like a concept that's the fact that it's not intuitive makes it really hard to explain, I think. Is that fair? Okay. So it's yeah, so kind of like that. By making that let's say by making it a positioned element, rather than saying by making it relative, it has to be a positioned element. Yeah, exactly. And so a positioned element would be absolute, relative, fixed. Sticky, I believe, is another one, which I'm not even going to get into because it's not really very important at this point. But just that there are these positioned elements, and if every parent is static, then it'll go all the way to the root viewport. But if any of those elements are positioned, then it will use that and be absolutely positioned relative to that element. Sorry, I really am. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, like you said, fixed. Like I said, fixed is just now that if it's scrolling. Usually we use that for headers. Like you just put it there. Naturally, it's there. Okay, it's fixed. Good. If I scroll, it doesn't move. Everything moves underneath it. And you will be doing that this week with Tweeter. Your header bar, it'll have to stay at the top, and as you scroll the tweets underneath it, the header bar should stay there. I recommend looking into fixed for that. Okay. Little me. Going to teleport to Vancouver. Awesome. Okay. Oops. So, talked a little bit about selectors. We know that we can pass in a list of selectors, right? That was one of the things we talked about today. It's a comma-separated list of selectors. Is someone willing to tell me the difference between these two selectors that I have here? Are they different? Ah, yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, we're going to guess. Great.
First one, div primary, is saying that any div tag class primary.
Yeah, okay, so let me just repeat it for them. So they said, so she was saying the first tag is any div tag with the class primary. That is correct.
And I'm guessing the second one is any div class and any div tag and any class primary, but he's just having
Okay. Yeah. So, so the second one was maybe any div tag or anything with class primary. If that were the case, this is what we would do. So that actually illustrates another difference, right? But I do want to call out that when we have this space here, it means that there is a div tag that's where one of its descendants has the class primary. Kind of weird, right? Like, so if I have a div tag and then even 3 levels down, something in there has a class primary, it would match this. So this is where we get into, actually, yeah, combinators, I think that's what it is, CSS and MDN, right? Please, there we go. Combination selector list. So this is where you're going to find the documentation on this. That's my selector list, so I can put a comma between selectors, and it means this or this. I can then put a space, and this is a descendant combinator, meaning B is a descendant somewhere down the line of A. So that was my second example, right? I was being very specific with div.primary. That would just be A or B. Whereas what you were seeing, again, is a space dot or div space dot primary falls in this category. Any element matching B that is a descendant of an element matching A. That means any descendant, doesn't matter what's in between. A child combinator, so if I were to put a greater than symbol there instead, means a direct descendant. So it has to be the child of it. A div with the child primary with a child that has the class primary, right? And then this one's about siblings, and this one is about I don't know, one of the next. No one uses this. Don't worry about it. We don't want to overdo it. We just want to make sure we know what we want to get out of this is that this is a very important difference, and that this would behave very differently. So we have to keep that in mind. That putting a space between that div and that dot primary does actually mean something. Cool? Okay. So if I'm going to target something as div.primary, I'm being relatively specific about it. It means any div tag with the class primary, which is more specific than any div class or any div tag or anything with the class primary. That's less specific, right? I could have spans with the class primary, still hits it. I could have divs with any other class, still hits it. So there is this concept of specificity. And the more specific we are, that's the rule that's going to be applied. If two things are meant to change the same property of an element, the one that is more specific will change that property. If they are the same specificity, the one that comes second will assign that property, right? So this morning we talked all about how order matters. Okay, so let's go back and think, okay, order matters after specificity. First we're specific, and then the order matters. Okay, and this is great because it actually does give us a level of control that, although confusing, allows us to not have to constantly reorder things or get caught in this situation where we want to order it one way for one thing and the other way for another. That can happen. So let's talk about the rules of specificity. One is div with the class primary, one is div and the yeah, exactly. Okay, right. So there's div and then things with the class primary. So yeah, I think that was the same thing Shmoo said. I think we got good understanding of that now, that this matters. All right. And thanks for the feedback to my question. I'm not quite used to it getting responses from the remote cohort. It's really nice, but I'm not used to it, so it's great. Okay, let's talk about specificity. This is a situation where we might want to bring up this little sheet that I have here, and this kind of makes it a bit fun. This is CSS specificity under the shining theme of things. So what they've done, and I've seen boxes and things like this before with other themes, but this is kind of a fun one. So the universal selector is not specific at all, let's say. That's this star that you saw me use this morning. It would have a specificity value of, let's say, 0 for argument purpose here. But a div, it's a little more specific, right? We're only targeting a certain type of tag. And so in that case, its specificity is going to be 1 here. Okay, and I'm going to talk to you about these positions and stuff. But we'll also see here that if I use an li that has a direct ul descendant, that has a specificity of 2. So the difference, if I had li or ul here, it would have a specificity of 1. And if I have li greater than ul, it has a specificity of 2. The second one is more specific. So it would be the property would be applied on that one instead. Yes? So the question is, li is li greater than ul. Does that mean the li is the child of the ul? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the question is, why is this example so shitty, right? Well, because it is, because it's not intuitive. I can have a ul with li's, and in one of those li's, I could have another ul. And that's what they're saying here, although I think I would have described this the other way because it's more intuitive the other way, where forget the crazy nesting, just say I have a ul with a child that's an li. That would illustrate the exact same point. Yeah, so I think it's a poor example on this thing here, but what if we did, this is now 9 different tags. So we're seeing that this number goes up as the number of tags goes up. And so what we're going to do is position these things here. We're going to say that the tag is sort of the least specific way to describe something. A class is a bit more specific, and then the ID is, let's say, one of the most specific ways we can do it, because we know that ID can only be applied to one thing ever, right? So in this column of ID, it's going to be 1 or 0. If you are, so that here, for the p tag, I've just got one tag, so we're going to put 1 in the tag column, and we're going to say that this is a specificity of 1, right? The second one, article space p, which is an article that has a child somewhere that's a p tag, it's just 2 tags still, has a specificity of 2. So we put 2 in the tag column. That's how we get that. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay. Now I have this image.bio.rounded. That's how I could add 2 classes to an image tag. And so here's where it gets interesting, because we've set the class in the position of the class specificity digits. We put 2 there, and then we put 1 in the tag. So I'd say that has a specificity of 21. Kind of makes sense? So that's the most specific we've gotten so far. It's more specific than the other 2 for sure. Now if we have an ID container, we just put, because it's an ID, we put 1 in the ID column. That is, let's say 100. That's even more specific. So this number does have a bearing. Now what's tricky about it is that we don't limit ourselves at 9, so it's not like base 10 digits. We might get 11 in that class column. That's still higher than 12 in the tag column. That's still more specific than 12 in the 12 tags. 11 classes is more specific than 12 tags. That kind of makes sense? Okay. So here, the last one, we got a div with the ID container that also has the class centered. And we'll say that that is specificity of maybe like 111 or whatever, right? Okay. So let's go through this exercise. The first example, div.warning space p. So it's describing a selector where we have a div that has a class warning, and then some descendant of that div with the class warning is a paragraph. We're going to apply the color cyan to it. What would be its specificity? Okay, how many tags? 2 tags. So that's where you get the 2 and the 12 from, yeah. One would be, sorry, 2 tags, 1 class. So 0, 1, 2. Okay. Oh, I can go back to it. Oops, I can go back to it. Right. So, yeah. Well, and again, it's hard to say 12 because it's not base 10. It's like base unlimited. Although in practice it does kind of look like base 10, because very rarely are we going to use 10 tags to be that specific. That doesn't make sense. Okay, so 0, 1, 2, that is relatively specific. What are the next one here? Body with an ID of home that has a descendant with a class container that has a descendant of a paragraph tag. It's very specific, right? So we expect this number to go up now. 112. So 1 for the ID, 1 for the number of classes, and 2 for the number of tags. That's right. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. So if this is the case, then we can see how we can actually affect the way the color is applied, because in this second one here, it's very specific. So that's going to get the magenta color, whereas if we did not have this, it would use the cyan color instead, right? It uses these rules to decide. And even if these are out of order, the specificity is going to determine that it's this one here, the second one instead. Okay. Oh, right. 001, we just have a tag. That's pretty straightforward, right? So that's not very specific. It's the least specific so far. What about the last one? 102. So we got 1 for the ID, 0 because there's no classes, 2 for the tags. I think we understand specificity a bit better, right? So this is the one that is the most specific, and that is the one that is going to apply to the paragraph that's somewhere inside of a container, or something that has a container class that's somewhere inside of the body with the ID home. Kind of contrived example. Okay, so this is really important because this helps us apply things, but there's more things we have to think about with specificity. Style tags, like I said this morning, we avoid those in a lot of cases. They are the most specific, because they're right on that element. So those rules that I just taught you sort of irrelevant if I apply a style like this. If anything, those things that match, this will overwrite it. So here we go, even more specific, style tag. And then we got a situation where we can actually mark things as important. And important will break all those rules and take precedence over everything else. How does that sound? Sorry? Tempting. Tempting. It's like, oh, I don't know why this isn't applying. If I could either figure out the specificity of these elements and then compare them, and I'm good at that now, or I can just put exclamation important, and then it'll just apply it, right? But then my question for you is, if everything is important, then what is now important? right? So this is the issue that we run into if we're not careful with this, and we make everything important. Now nothing is important, and we have to go back to our specificity and ordering rules to reapply things. So just be careful with this. Don't just put it in there to fix a problem. Sometimes we do this to overwrite styles that come in from maybe a framework. Some third parties provided to us some styles that are being applied somewhere. We don't necessarily want to be more specific, so in our style sheet we might put it important there. Just really sparingly with this, okay? All right. So any questions about what we've talked about so far? Right? Position, specificity, we've now added those to our understanding. Good. All right. Grid layouts with CSS. I alluded this a little bit this morning, but this is what we're really after. This is how we create our web applications, is through these grid-based layouts. And I want to show you. I didn't know this when I became a web developer. This wasn't even something that people really considered. Kind of it was, I don't know, kind of a joke at that point. Design wasn't really super involved. The web has evolved so much, and over that time I've learned from designers that for them to create designs based on a grid layout is very natural. And so I started to get delivered these Photoshop documents from designers where if you enable a certain layer, it would enable this overlay over top of it showing all of the columns that they used in designing that page. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, and sure enough, we can translate that to our web page by creating representative columns and then spanning these things across multiple columns, for example, right? So here, this is a 12-column grid, which is very common, because the nice thing about a 12-column grid is it divides very nicely into 12 one-column grids, or 6 two-column grids, or etc. 3, 4, the other way around. We can go either way. And so if that's the case, we can start to break our UI up a little bit more like that, right? So here, if I don't hide it anymore, this thing here, the header is it spans 12 columns, so it takes up the whole width. Then there's another row below that, and the sidebar takes up 3 columns, and the content takes up 9 columns, so that's your 12 columns taken up for that middle row. And then the bottom, I want to do 3 footer, let's say columns, and so each one would be 4 columns wide. And so this is what I end up with in a situation like that. And this is what we would do if we were using Bootstrap or any of those popular frameworks, is we would use their grid system to describe our app in this way. Okay, that's why we're doing this. Any questions about this? Okay. So I'm going to show you the example that I have on how you could actually build one of these grid systems, and no one's going to ask you to do this. I just kind of thought it would be useful to see kind of what goes on behind a Bootstrap style grid. And remember, this is Bootstrap 1, 2, and 3. Bootstrap 4 has moved away from this this definition of a grid. So I got my document. It is grid.html here. And it's going to import, it's going to normalize, so I'll do my CSS reset. I will import my grid CSS file, which is going to define those grid properties that I'm going to able to use. I've got a bunch of other stuff here. The body, for example, I just want to set some stuff on the body, so that's not really relevant. We're going to come back to this in a second, because right now it just looks like a bunch of gibberish, but it makes more sense if we come back to it. And then I've got this div container, which has a margin top of 40. And I think the purpose of that is just to separate these two things. That's all. That's why I put that 40 in there. So we won't worry about that. What we really care about is all the CSS that exists inside here, and also the way that we use it is important. So again, I had kind of shown you, if we break this thing into rows and columns, then maybe you could define this here, this row, each one has its own column of a size 1. That's 12 columns. And when we get down to the layout here, this is probably more representative of what you're actually going to see. My container has a row inside of it, and the navigation takes up the entire width, 12 columns. And then my row has a sidebar that takes up 3 columns and a content panel that takes up 9 columns. So this is how I would actually define that in my HTML. But that means we need these classes here. A class that tells this column how wide it is, and a class that tells this column how wide it is as well, right? And so, and then down here we have another row with 4 columns. So this is kind of the interface we have into the grid system. The way that that will be implemented, I'm going to set up border box first. We talked about why that is this morning. Just because I don't want my columns to grow if the padding changes. I want them to them to be set relative to kind of the size of the window, so it's going to be used percentage for that. But I want when I add padding for that not to change the size. So border box is the solution to that. I'm also doing div.row overflow hidden, and I showed this morning that that was a way to do that clear fix that we needed. And so this was one of the approaches I showed you. But that div after pseudo selector with the clear both would also work in this situation. Clear fix is not the important part here. This is where it starts to get kind of interesting. Anybody want to guess what this property, what we're going to match with this first one up here? Yeah, if you want to share. Yeah.
Any div element with the class that starts with the term call.
Yeah. So any div element that has a class that starts with call hyphen. And this is because I don't want to have to I don't have to create a class call 1, call 2, call 3, call 4, and then put float left, padding right in every single one of them. I can just kind of, well, in this case, it's actually quite easy. I can use this pattern matching kind of syntax. Yeah, and you're going to find that there's a whole new world of CSS inside those square brackets that there's no way I can talk about and describe today. And actually, I even called it out specifically in my notes saying here, we don't have time for pseudo elements, pseudo classes, etc. Those kind of pseudo selectors like that. But there's so much to CSS that unfortunately I had to make some decisions. All right. Okay, so that was exactly right. What about this one right here? Okay. Yeah. So this is great. So what Klaus says, it's only the last one. I don't want it to go off to the side. And it's not the float that it's changing. It's actually, if I look at my document here, and I inspect it, we're going to see that this element has padding. This element has these all have padding, and that's going to essentially put a gap between them. Although I think it's kind of hard to see here. Maybe if I zoom. Right, that little gap there, it's going to separate those columns. It's going to give us a bit of breathing room between them, so that's important. But we'll notice that it's only on all of the columns except the last one. We don't need padding on the last column. So what my CSS is saying is the last element of that type, set its padding right to 0 because everything else, all the ones before will have a padding of 20 pixels, right? So this is a way for us we're actually applying this to actually every single one of them, and then we're overwriting just the last one to get rid of that padding again. And this is a technique that you could use for that. So now we get into this situation where I'm actually defining each of these, right? And that's okay because they actually do mean different things when it comes to the width. But I don't have to. That's what I was saving myself from. Actually, these should all have, I just noticed that based on that, these should all have semicolons after them. You'll notice we didn't actually notice that until I put another property in there that it complained about that. Okay, so I could do an update on that. So let's see. Call 1 has a width of 8.3% of the window. Did I make that up, that number? Where might that come from? It's a 12th. Yeah, exactly. So 8.3% is 1/12 of 100%. So I just made that calculation. I put it in here, and I did the same for 2. And we can see 3 columns takes up a quarter of the page. 4 columns takes up, 33%, a third of the page, and etc. Until we get all the way to the top 100%. So this is how I've defined my grid now. And I can use this in here with that info. Does this kind of make sense? And again, this is not uncommon. We go to Bootstrap. which you're all going to be using for your midterm projects, most likely. Well, you don't have. I don't think you have to, but it's recommended. We go in here and we look for layout, grid, and we're going to see, again, similar interface, maybe slightly different implementation behind the scenes, but the goal is still the same. That we can define sort of how much space this thing takes up, and it's relative to the size of that window. And I think if we wanted to, you could design this to be more responsive in the sense that maybe if I make this smaller, then the sidebar and the content are stacked differently, but the responsive stuff is all going to happen later this week, kind of near the end of the week. So we're not worried about the responsiveness of this right now, but I believe that this is actually quite responsive. Let's see. Yeah, see how it kind of stacks vertically when you get to a certain size, and then goes horizontal when you have enough space for it. This is kind of why this can be useful to us, is that ultimately it can help us get closer to that responsive design or responsive UI design. All right. So if we take this same grid file, and instead we go over to layout.html, I'm going to load up this layout.html. Here is my Tweeter app. And if I inspect it, we can see that it has that same row and column interface to it. And it's, let's see, the row here, the top row, has 2 columns. One is 6 wide, 6 columns wide. The other is 6 wide. That makes sense? Their width are 50% because they have that col-6 property. Obviously, here we're getting that 16.6 repeated percent because that's how big a 2 is, right? So we can take that same idea and just apply it to the layouts that we want to build. And there's a little bit of CSS in there, nothing super special. Oh wait, I actually didn't go back and tell you about this other thing. My mistake. I promised we'd come back here and talk about this thing. So this is kind of, the reason why I didn't want to talk about it right away is because this and the nth child and the odd thing, all of that combined is quite a bit. But now we know what this matches, right? It's all the columns. But then it's going to take all the columns that it matches and find each odd child and only apply this style to the odd children. And it's going to apply this style to the even children. That's where I'm getting this alternating, oops. Oh, come on. I just want to zoom this other side. Click. There we go. That's how we're getting these alternating column colors, is through those selectors there. Okay. So I got CSS here. We can apply things like hover, active, and focus. So those are different states of that element. That's pretty useful. When I roll over the compose button, its style changes, and that's simply because I've added a button hover selector. I change its cursor to pointer when I roll over it. If I don't, oops. Now when I roll over, it's still an arrow. But now when I roll over, oh wait, now it becomes a pointer. So that kind of hover thing is pretty useful. Button active would be like, oops, if Apple would let me click on it and kind of hold on it without letting go, that would be kind of like the active, I believe. And then I just say focus outline none, because if I don't do this, look at that little outline around it now, right? I don't like that in my design. So maybe I want to keep that out. So what I would do is change its focus behavior to have an outline of none. So might have to do that as well. And again, it's the user agent that's applying that outline for me. I didn't decide that should be there, but I might need to overwrite it if I don't want that behavior myself. All right. So we got a little bit of time here. Let me just finish this up and then we can go through questions if there are any. So we talked a lot about float and how painful it can be to use and how we don't use that anymore and that we still want to learn it enough to be able to use it for this week. At the end of the day, if I'm creating some sort of layout that needs to either flow horizontally or vertically, I would most likely use Flexbox these days. So here's an example where I have this header with a bunch of buttons in it, one for news, music, and sports. And if I want to potentially position these things more like this, where they have an equivalent number of space, equivalent amount of space between, Flexbox would allow me to actually justify this content based on space between and actually span these things out like that. Or you could do space around, so they all have the same number of space around. There's lots of different properties we can put on this. If you're interested in Flexbox, this is the best way to get started, I think. Oh, old Flexbox Froggy. So it's going to teach you some of these properties, right? The first thing it's saying is, oh, this is level 24, so let's go back to level 1. Here we are, level 1. Let's get rid of the answer. Okay, so this is how it's going to start off. It's going to say, our goal is to take this frog, put it on the lily pad. And so these elements are in a Flexbox container, so we can justify the content to go to flex end. Okay, that moves it. Flex end means the elements all push to the right. That I wouldn't use float right for that. This is what I would use these days, right? Go to the next one. Oh, they animated and everything is so nice. Okay. Now, you got these two frogs, and they're in a container. We want to center them. Justify content. I think center. And there they go. They get so you can just kind of play with this. And by the end, when you go to level 24, it's trying to get you to put all these frogs with kind of different orders and different sides of the. It's actually once you get to this point, it's you pretty much learned all the Flexbox properties. So I'll let you get there. Here they are. Those are the ones you'd use. They help you. They tell you what they are. You can. So Flexbox Froggy, definitely a useful resource for introducing yourself to the Flexbox API, I say. All right. Now this idea of grid. Grid is if we need to actually have something more like the layout that I was talking about, which has rows and columns rather than just columns. In that case, we might want to use the grid. And so I'd be able to define the header, the sidebar, the content, and the footer all within the grid system, and it would position those elements here like this. I'm not going to get into details on that at all. I definitely watch some videos if I were you. It's pretty exciting stuff, and it's definitely where the web is going. So it's worth, I'd say Flexbox first, though. Learn Flexbox, then grid. Don't skip Flexbox. It's still important. All right. Questions? Okay. Okay, so Victoria, I just want to know whether or not there are questions or not before I turn it off. But I know you asked the questions anyways, so I'm going to assume that there are not any. Do we want to review anything? Just want to go back to work? Read my notes. That's actually the best thing you could do is probably read my notes because they make a lot more sense than I do. Okay. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.